Im Namen der Vorbereitungsgruppe für dieses Forum begrüße ich euch alle und ich freue mich besonders, dass wir jetzt endlich eine Möglichkeit haben, nach langen Pausen uns direkt auszutauschen und zu vernetzen. Das Forum heute hat die Überschrift Öffentliche Gesundheit und die Pandemien und dazu möchte ich Ignacio Ramonet zitieren, der zu dieser Covid- oder Corona-Pandemie sagte: Der Planet entdeckt verblüfft, dass es keinen Kommandeur an Bord gibt. Die WHO ist wegen ihrer strukturellen Komplizenschaft mit den Pharmamultis diskreditiert und Attac Frankreich hat festgestellt, dass es ein chaotisches und autoritäres Management der Gesundheitskrise durch die französische Regierung gegeben hat. Ich denke, das gilt nicht nur für die französische Regierung. 2 Jahre später können wir feststellen, gesundheitsmäßig ist es keineswegs besser geworden. Wir werden über Kämpfe viel erzählt bekommen. 2 Jahre später können wir feststellen, es hat eine weitere Schere zwischen Arm und Reich gegeben, verursacht durch die Maßnahmen, die getroffen worden sind bezüglich der Pandemie. Ich möchte begrüßen die beiden Moderatorinnen. Das sind erstmal Agnès Moussion von Attac Frankreich. Sie war Lehrerin für Betriebswirtschaft, Gewerkschaftsmitglied und ist zurzeit sehr aktiv bei Attac Frankreich, und zwar in Nantes und im Bündnissen zum Gesundheitswesen. Und Dagmar Patenorga von Attac Deutschland ist Sozialarbeiterin, Psychotherapeutin und arbeitet besonders zu den Schwerpunkten bedingungsloses Grundeinkommen, Mindestnahrungseinkommen in den Ländern des Südens, Umverteilen und Gesundheitspolitik. Ich begrüße euch beide. Ihr werdet dieses Forum leiten, moderieren. Ich habe mich nicht vorgestellt. Ich bin einfach Marie-Dominique Wern von Attac Deutschland und Redaktionsmitglied von Santim Getriebe. Ich wünsche uns ein schönes Forum.
Bonjour. Alors d'abord, je suis vraiment très très contente d'être avec vous et je vous remercie beaucoup d'être ici également. Un grand remerciement également aux personnes qui s'occupent de la traduction parce que c'est pas une chose tout à fait aisée. Rapidement, je vais vous dire le déroulé de ce matin. Donc, il sera en 2 parties. Une première partie où on va parler des mesures prises contre la pandémie du Covid qui ont renforcé les inégalités au niveau national, au niveau mondial. Nous essaierons d'expliquer un petit peu ce que sont les biens communs et notamment l'eau et la santé. Qu'est-ce qu'on peut attendre d'un système de santé publique ? Et pourquoi le système de santé publique est sous pression partout dans le monde. Donc nous aurons quelques interventions d'intervenants, d'intervenantes, des questions de vous, du public, si vous en avez, ou des demandes d'apport complémentaires par rapport à ce qui a été dit. Une petite pause de 2 minutes et nous passerons à la deuxième partie, dans laquelle nous parlerons surtout des luttes actuellement un petit peu dans tous les pays. Et les luttes, est-ce qu'elles débouchent sur des améliorations, sur des progrès? Et si oui, tant mieux. Et sinon, comment est-ce qu'on peut faire pour être plus efficace dans nos luttes? Dans la première partie, nous allons avoir avec nous Riccardo Petrella, qui est à ma gauche, et donc qui, après avoir parlé beaucoup politique, avoir enseigné l'économie, la politique, plein de choses, et qui est né en Italie, et qui a fait ses études à Florence, nous parlera de toutes ces questions, et notamment avec l'Agora qu'il a mis en place des habitants de la Terre. Et il pourra détailler à cette occasion les biens communs, et surtout deux biens communs qui sortent et qui sont d'une grande évidence, l'eau et la santé. Dans cette première partie également, Masa Seyoun, qui est né en Éthiopie, qui travaille avec les People Vaccine Alliance et qui comprennent 80 membres, dont l'Alliance africaine, Oxfam, entre autres. Et là, elle travaille beaucoup pour des groupes de la société civile, pour l'intégration du monde entier, pour l'expertise, pour des histoires et des voix d'Afrique, d'Asie, des Caraïbes. Donc une personne également particulièrement intéressante. Donc je remercie tout le monde et je passe maintenant la parole à Dagmar pour la présentation des autres intervenantes.
Ja, hallo. Ich freue mich, dass ihr alle gekommen seid und so viel Interesse an dem Thema habt. Wir werden im zweiten Teil, das ich moderiere, hauptsächlich über die Kämpfe, die in den Ländern stattfinden, reden und uns vielleicht auch Gedanken darüber machen, wie wir uns besser in Europa und global vernetzen können. Da wird als erste Silvia Habekost sprechen. Sie ist Krankenschwester, Gewerkschaftsaktivistin, Mitglied der Berliner Krankenhausbewegung und des Bündnisses Gesundheit statt Fabrik, Profite. Und sie ist auch in unserem Bündnis Krankenhaus statt Fabrik, wo auch einige von Attac mitarbeiten, unter anderem auch ich, seit langem aktiv dabei. Und sie kämpft für die Veränderungen in der Finanzierung des Gesundheitswesens, also weg von den DRGs, insbesondere in Krankenhäusern, und für eine Gesundheitsversorgung für Menschen statt für Profit und für eine verbindliche Personalausstattung in den Krankenhäusern. Da haben Sie und Ihre Mitstreiterinnen in Berlin ja einen aktiven Streik wochenlang durchgehalten und auch einiges errungen. Darüber wird sie aber berichten. Und dann haben wir noch Diane Maria Blandina. Diane ist Aktivistin von People's Health Movement, die kürzlich am WHO-Watch-Programm teilgenommen und an einem Kapitel über die Privatisierung der Gesundheitsversorgung im Global Health Watch 6 mitgearbeitet hat. Zurzeit forscht und lebt sie in Deutschland. Diane ist ursprünglich aus Indonesien. Okay. Ja, dann fangen wir mal an, Agnès.
On va commencer donc directement avec Ricardo pour un aperçu plus général après de passer sur les luttes. Et donc la première question posée, c'était comment les mesures prises contre la pandémie ont-elles plutôt aggravé les inégalités dans le monde?
Well, good morning to everybody. I will start immediately with two figures. Today there is, according to World Health Organization, 3.6 billion people without any health protection. 3.6 billion people without protection. It means that they have no right to life. And I have the impression that the tendency is to accept it as a fact. We are not really pushed to make a revolution. We accept it. We try to modify it, try to mitigate it, but we accept the fact that the billion people without health protection is a matter of fact, is a natural societal phenomenon. The second figure is that a few days ago came to end the collection of the European citizen initiatives, No Health with Profit, the right to health. You have heard about it. And this was the one very important European citizens initiative. There was not a petition. This was a process of participation to deliberation of policy formation at the European level. Through the European Citizens Initiatives, citizens can participate to the elaboration of new legislative proposals. Only 240,000 citizens signed. The minimum was 1 million. Does it mean that Europeans do not care about health? Does it mean that European militancy is so weak? A few years ago, we organized, I was belonging to this because I was working in this area, Water European Initiative. We collected 1.8 million signatures. And therefore, we formulated proposals on water European policy. In European health policy is a failure. Why? Which are the main features of today's health problems? The first is that I have the impression that we have moved back to the system of assistance, typically American. Americans, again, have globalized their system. Everywhere now, health is an individual problem. It's an individual solution. And we abandoned the system of health as a security system. A security system means that everybody has definitely the right to health, but that is no longer the case. Because we accepted that health is a commodity, drugs are commodities, hospitals are just commodity houses, or commodity services houses. Health is no longer a common good. We do not feel responsible of health as a common good at global level. It's too difficult to talk about a global common good. We consider that it's already so difficult to solve problems at national level that it's impossible, just rhetorically, impossible to solve global problems. Because we accepted that commodification of life is one of the main features of today's contemporary society. We accepted that finance matters more than life. Financial parameters determines where you are going to create an hospital, what kind of vaccines are you going to use, at which price, who has to pay, who has to make profit. People will do not participate. The billion African people have nothing to say, nothing to say, because they are not a market. If you are not a market, why you want to say a thing? Why you want to have a word on it? You don't exist. This is why even recently in France, what was the major problem of the elections, of the political elections? The purchasing power. If you have not a good purchasing power, you don't exist. And this is why everybody says, yeah, let's have less taxes, let's increase my salaries, my wage, because if I cannot buy, I don't exist. It's under these conditions that I think that one of the main characteristics of health problems today is the absence of res publica. Politics does not exist. policy. A society which does policy, not a society that has a management. Health system today shows that we are only obliged to deal with management problems. The health is a management problem. How to train nurses, how to produce products, how to maintain stability in the market, production, etc., etc. It's a management. It's not a government. And this is why, personally, I would invite you to reflect on this. Why don't we talk any longer of government and we talk just about governance? Governance, because we accepted also that the basic principle of societal organization is interest, utility. Why do we speak more and more about stakeholders? And we speak less about citizens? The governance of stakeholders, great. Health problem in the world must be governed by stakeholders. And you are a stakeholder. You attack, you are a stakeholder. You university people, academic, researcher, you are stakeholders. And all this together gives an image of today's situation. People would say a black image. I personally consider that it is a realistic image which pushes you to have together have a very strong, practical vision of a problem and of solutions. I think that I stop here. I didn't need to use all the 12 minutes, but please appreciate that an Italian is able to stop talking. Huh?
Oui, c'est absolument parfait, mais j'aimerais quand même une petite question. Pourquoi le système de santé publique mondial est sous pression et pourquoi partout c'est la même histoire qui se reproduit? Quelles sont les forces en œuvre?
The answer, ou la réponse gît sur la question de la commodification de la connaissance. C'est-à-dire que nos sociétés sont marquées par le fait que la science est considérée, la connaissance est considérée une commodity, une marchandise. Parce qu'on n'accepte plus le fait que quelque chose puisse exister qui ne soit pas une marchandise, c'est-à-dire qui ne soit pas soumise aux règles du marché, c'est-à-dire l'échange. Et pourquoi on donne tellement de force au marché? Parce que le marché est le mécanisme de détermination de la valeur des choses, le prix. Le prix. Toute chose a une valeur en fonction de son prix. Si vous n'avez pas de prix, si vous ne coûtez pas 2000 € par mois, comment vous différenciez par celui qui gagne 800? C'est le prix. Et le prix, c'est le marché. Et le marché, c'est la marchandise. Et la marchandise, c'est l'utilité. Et c'est pour cela que, même à propos de la santé, nous, en Europe, on a accepté le langage centenaire américain qui dit que, par exemple, la santé est une utilité publique, est public utility. Vous imaginez qu'aux États-Unis, depuis 150 ans, on a une culture de la santé marquée par le fait qu'il soit un public utility. Et que s'il n'y a pas d'utilité, C'est pas quelque chose d'intéressant. Et on a tellement mystifié la culture, le langage que nous utilisons, que public est marché, quoi. Que même le concept de public est marchandisé. Et c'est pour cela qu'à l'ère actuelle, la plupart des gens, même au sein de nous, les mouvements progressistes, pensent qu'un bien public puisse être géré par le privé. Parce que la question n'est pas de savoir si c'est un droit ou pas. La question est de savoir est-ce que c'est rentable ou pas. Et c'est ça qui explique un tout petit peu pourquoi le monde est égal partout. Parce que ton vaccin, ceux qui sont dominants, les vaccins dominants, sont égaux partout. Ceux qui ne sont pas dominants, les vaccins ne valent rien. Voilà.
Merci pour ce constat et pour la réponse. Je vais donner la parole à Maza, voilà, pour les mêmes questions et voir si quel sera son apport.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay. Thank you. It's really an honor to be here. I really want to thank the organizers, particularly ATTAC Germany, for allowing me my first trip ever to Germany and inviting me to this inspiring event. So thank you very much for that. As Agnes has mentioned, I'm with the People's Vaccine Alliance, and we are a coalition of over 100 organizations that came together for a people's vaccine, so one that is based on shared knowledge and is available to everyone everywhere for free. We're also now involved in the fight for COVID treatment and COVID testing, which are two things that are still also being treated in an unequal manner, the way that vaccines have. We've worked quite a bit on the questions of intellectual property and, as I said, sharing of technology around vaccines. I'm happy to say that the People's Health Movement is a member of the People's Vaccine Alliance, which is very exciting for us. They're recently joined the People's Vaccine Alliance. This year, we've also started to get more into pandemic preparedness because we've seen that as a global system, we don't like to learn from our previous mistakes. So this is something that the People's Vaccine Alliance has also gotten involved in, is the work of pandemic preparedness for the next pandemic. I just wanted to say, remind people that the People's Vaccine Alliance came together really based on an open letter in May 2020, an open letter that was drafted by people, and I think some of us, will remember those days, people who worked on the battle for HIV treatment. There was a period when people in the North, so in Europe, in North America, with HIV were living healthy lives, while in the rest of the world, and in particular in Africa, people were denied access to HIV treatment for the same reasons that we're seeing now with COVID vaccines, pharmaceutical companies wanting to make money off of products, US and other governments basically saying that Africans didn't deserve or didn't have a right to treatment because at that time we were told that we couldn't tell time since we didn't have watches and we wouldn't be able to take our medication on time. And we laugh now because it sounds so ridiculous, but this was 20 years ago. Sorry, the speed. 20 years ago, the head of the US Agency for International Development sat in a government office in Washington and testified to this, that it would be a waste to provide treatment in Africa because Africans did not have watches and could not tell time and would not be able to adhere to treatment. The South African government was sued for trying to provide treatment at low cost to people. In my own family, 3 of my cousins died of HIV during that period in Ethiopia when treatment was not available in Africa while it was available in the rest of the world. So the People's Vaccine Alliance was put together by groups of people who had understood that history and were advising the world not to make the same mistake again. Unfortunately, we did not learn from those old mistakes and have made the same mistakes again. I thought it was important just to ground us in where we stand in terms of vaccine inequity for COVID. I know that in some places there is a perception that the pandemic is over. I know that many countries, people have received their fourth dose or are receiving their fifth dose of vaccines. There are still many countries in the world. There are 10 countries in the world right now that are still below 10% vaccination for COVID-19. That goes from Burkina Faso, which is at about 8%, all the way down to Haiti and Burundi. Haiti is at about 1.5% vaccinated, and Burundi at not even 1% vaccinated. So we have really failed as a global system to even reach the modest goals of the World Health Organization that had said that they hoped by the middle of this year, every country would have vaccinated 70% of its population. We are nowhere near that goal. And as this is happening, just the other day, the UK announced that it is providing now the new upgraded Omicron vaccine to citizens in the UK. I'm sure that will happen soon in Germany as well. So here there are new tools for a new variant, while in the rest of the world, even the old vaccines have not yet been made available. And the same inequity that we saw with vaccines, we are also seeing with treatment and with diagnostics. When we talk about the reinforcement of inequalities, that's something that I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on, because the human cost and the economic cost of this pandemic has been massive, and the fact that we have acted in such a way promoting inequality has meant that the pandemic itself has been prolonged. If we had not acted in such a self-interested, nationalist, and greedy way as a global system, we might have avoided the one much more dangerous variant, the Delta variant, or the more contagious variant, the Omicron variant, which we are dealing with now. Women have been hit particularly hard all around the world by this pandemic. As we know, in much of the world, women are more involved in the informal economy. So when things are shut down, there's less support for women in terms of their work and how they make money. The access to education issue has been enormous. I have heard many people in the North, in Europe and in the United States, rightfully complain about how difficult it was to have kids educated on Zoom at home during the pandemic, during lockdown. But I would just like to remind people that there are many countries in the world where people do not have access to the internet and do not have laptops at home. I was in Ethiopia when the pandemic started, and kids were just in the street. That's it. There's no school, there are no laptops, there's no access to the internet to be able to do Zoom school. In a country like Uganda, which had the longest shutdown of schools, children did not go to school for 2 years. 2 years for public school kids, no school at all. So imagine what that has meant for those kids and their education. When the schools finally reopened at the beginning of the year, 30% of girls just did not go back to school at all. So what has that meant for those girls? Many girls forced into early marriage in order to be able to relieve some of the cost for their families. There was a rise in unintended teenage pregnancies. There was a rise in HIV incidence. Everything that comes with, that lack of education and the impact of the pandemic on women. There has also been a rise in gender-based violence. And often when we hear these stories, we talk about countless women tell stories of an increase in gender-based violence. But for me, I'm trying to really limit my use of that word countless, because each one of those people counts and their life has been changed forever, by this pandemic. Something else to note that we talk about in a way that is not equal is deaths. I don't know if you remember early on, there were all these stories about how the pandemic seemed to not have affected Africa so much. We kept hearing people are just not dying there. Maybe they're genetically different. Maybe it's because they're younger. Maybe it's because it's warm and the windows are open. Really, the reality was that there were no tests. People were dying without realizing what they were dying of. And now The Economist, So the official death rate for COVID at the moment is about 6.5%. 6.5 million people, sorry. And The Economist, which is not known, I think, to be the most liberal, progressive of all outlets in the world, The Economist's modeling is showing that at least 15 million people, or maybe close to 25 million people, have actually, in reality, probably died of COVID when you look at the excess deaths modeling. So that misconception about people in low and middle income countries not having been hit as hard by COVID is also completely false. And what the data has shown is that for every life lost in a rich nation, another 4 people have died in a poorer country. And within countries, people from minority groups are more likely to die of COVID. So even in Brazil, Black Brazilians are 1.5 times more likely to die of COVID than white Brazilians. Same in the United States. You have Native Americans, Black people, what in the US are called Latinx people, who are 2 to 3 times more likely to die of COVID than white people. And I have not seen the data for Europe, but I'm assuming that the data is similar here as well. And then Ricardo already spoke about the economic impact. The data has also shown that 160 million people have fallen into poverty during this pandemic. Now, and that data that I saw was before the impact of inflation and food price increases with the war in Europe. Now that number is probably even higher. But during the pandemic, the 10 richest men in the world doubled their fortunes. So when you had over 160 million people fall into poverty, the 10 richest men in the world doubled their fortunes during this pandemic. So as I said, one of the things that's most disturbing to me is the repeat that we're seeing from the HIV era. Here we have, men in air-conditioned rooms basically deciding who gets to live and who gets to die. I hope we can talk a little bit more about the multilateral systems that were set up to try and develop more equitable sharing of vaccines and why those systems failed. But I just want to remind people that, we've seen this before, we're seeing it again. And I wanted to quote, I think it's really important to tell the truth about why some of these things are happening the way they are. And I wanted to quote, if you'll allow me, an open letter from the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Her name is Tendai Achume, she's Zambian, and she made this statement at the World Trade Organization's 12th Ministerial Conference, which took place in June, where they were discussing what we call the TRIPS waiver, the waiver that would hopefully allow for a waiving of some of the intellectual property rules around vaccines and other COVID tools. So she said, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has highlighted how the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 between and within countries reproduces colonial hierarchies and represents the international community's failure to redress the effects of racism rooted in slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. Certain developed nations and powerful transnational corporations based within their jurisdictions have monopolized authority to determine who is worth saving. And this hierarchical power cannot be unlinked from its colonial origins. Researchers have observed that the map of winners and losers in the COVID-19 vaccination race appears almost indistinguishable from the map of European colonialism. And that's the irony, that if you look at that map, it looks almost exactly the same in terms of who had access to COVID tools and who did not. And as we sit here in Europe with motivated activists like yourselves who want to change the system and make the world better, I just wanted to highlight that. What is at the root of the system that always decides who gets to live and who gets to die? So I think I'll leave it at that for now, and maybe we can talk a little bit more about the systems later. Thank you so much.
Merci Mazin. Diane, je vais te donner la parole si tu veux, un petit peu. Je pense qu'il est branché. Oui. Oui.
Yes, my name is Diane, and I am from the People's Health Movement. To tell you a bit about what we do in People's Health Movement is that we believe that health is a right, and we continue to struggle for that. And this is a continuing struggle, I would say, mainly from the countries of the global south to truly achieve our independence. Many of the world system right now that existed, it's still continuing along the structure of the colonial system. And since the 1980s, because neoliberalism has been the prevailing ideology that is driving globalization, the transnational corporations helped by developed nations have been taking advantage of this world system and essentially bringing back a lot of the things that we experienced during the colonial era through profit making, of course. And during the colonial rule, one of the things that were kept from us, of course, is our right for health and education. In fact, if you want to see the constitutions of a lot of developing countries after World War II, when we achieve our independence, the right to health and education is there. It's an aspiration, but this has been largely forgotten, as Ricardo also has mentioned. So that's a lot of part of our struggle. Also, we this right to health had been tried to achieve before. This global cooperation, the commitment through the Alma-Ata Declaration in the 1978, based on developing countries' experience and aspirations, but of course it was hampered and blocked by developed nations also, with help with corporations and globalists. So we in People's Health Movement believe in the principles of Alma-Ata, and we strive in our struggles to achieve that through our protests, our work in journalistic research, and also our interventions at the governance at all levels, the global, regional, and national levels. I participated previously last May in the World Health Assembly in Geneva, and what I saw there was truly a bit sad, even from people who were experienced working for decades in the WHO were quite a bit surprised by the amount of lobbying by corporations that was there in the WHO, and also the way that a lot of developing countries have been kept out from discussions, and also civil society participations has been increasingly limited in various ways. So we try very hard to break that also. As I mentioned previously, the neoliberalism aspect, part of the by that I mean like the vigorous promotion of private enterprises with minimal government intervention that is spilled over in health. And privatization in healthcare has been a major problem in developing countries, but I see now also in Europe, which is surprising to me because I expected it would be a bit better here. But this, of course, the privatization of, especially for profit, left a lot of the sectors in the health system not developed or neglected, especially community health programs that are much needed by marginalized, disadvantaged communities. Rural health programs are neglected. In some countries completely stopped already. And also for medical care, sectors that are units that are not particularly or have low profit margins, like the emergency and intensive cares have been cut back. I also see that here in Germany, and also in the UK. And guess what we needed for the pandemic? Community programs, primary care, intensive care, and emergency. So that probably explains a bit why we failed in the pandemic. I mean, on top of what Masa and Ricardo already explained. So I would close this here.
Eh bien, merci pour ces trois intervenants. Et nous allons maintenant passer à un petit moment de questionnement, si vous voulez bien. Donc, on va vous lever la main, vous essayez de répartir la parole hommes-femmes et vous essayez de ne pas être trop long pour que tout le monde puisse éventuellement poser des questions. Donc, je vais me déplacer et je vous donne le micro au fur et à mesure de vos besoins. Je commence.
Oui, bonjour. Donc, Eric du syndicat Sud Santé Sociaux. Vous entendez ? Plus fort. Donc, Eric du syndicat Sud Santé Sociaux en France. Voilà. Donc, juste pour compléter, donc merci pour vos interventions. Ce qui ressort, c'est le besoin aussi de fédérer nos mobilisations au niveau international. C'est ça qui est important, parce que l'accès à la santé la nécessité de l'accès à la santé est le même dans tous les pays, donc c'est quelque chose qui doit permettre de dupliquer nos forces. Juste pour dire qu'en France, notre syndicat fait partie du réseau européen contre la privatisation et la commercialisation de la santé. Et donc il y a des syndicats et des organisations allemandes, italiennes, espagnoles, françaises et autres, qui essayent d'organiser des choses. Notamment, on appelle tous les ans le 7 avril la journée mondiale contre la commercialisation de la santé, et on invite bien sûr d'autres pays à nous rejoindre, parce que plus de pays se fédéreront, plus on sera fort dans nos mobilisations. Et juste pour parler un petit peu de la France, puisque peut-être qu'on parlera tout à l'heure des mobilisations, juste pour dire quand même que le gouvernement est en train de diviser. Il y a un mouvement social qui a été assez puissant en France pour l'accès à la santé, contre la destruction de l'hôpital public. Juste pour dire que le gouvernement a essayé de diviser la mobilisation, tout simplement en divisant les salariés par des augmentations de salaire à certains et pas à d'autres, en oubliant l'essentiel, justement, la case de l'hôpital public qui est en train de se dupliquer actuellement, suite à la nomination de M. Braun au gouvernement, qui est en train de développer la téléconsultation et de casser l'hôpital public au détriment du secteur libéral. Voilà, juste pour faire un petit panorama, de parler de ce qui se passe en France.
Merci. Alors, je crois que vous pouvez...
Agnès?
Oui.
Also, ich möchte euch bitten, möglichst die beiden Mikros zu benutzen. Das macht es uns einfacher. Und die Rednerinnen bitten, kurze Beiträge zu halten, weil wir um 11 Uhr mit dem ersten Part abschließen wollen und möglichst alle, die Fragen haben oder einen kurzen Beitrag drankommen können. Also wie gesagt, wir haben hier Mikros stehen, die auch in Funktion sind, wo ihr euch hinbegeben könnt.
Il faut s'approcher du micro.
Hallo, ich bin im Krebsforschungsbereich tätig und ich hatte den Eindruck während meiner Forschung, dass sehr viel Vorarbeit von den Forschungsinstituten geleistet werden muss, damit die Pharmaindustrie überhaupt interessiert ist an unseren Erkenntnissen, dass wir in hohem Maße ausgenutzt wurden, also öffentliche Mittel verwendet wurden, um später private Profite zu finanzieren. Und was mich interessieren würde jetzt in Bezug auf Impfstoffproduktion, in den Ländern des globalen Südens. Es geht ja nicht nur um Patente, es geht auch um Trade Secrets, es geht da um die ganzen Herstellungsprozesse. Wie ist es möglich, an dieses Wissen zu kommen? Denn ansonsten kann die Herstellung, glaube ich, nicht so schnell und so erfolgreich gelingen.
Mazin, tu veux répondre, Diane?
Thank you for that. I have a couple of things to say, and I think others might want to add. Yes, much of the, at least for the Pfizer-BioNTech and for the Moderna vaccine and AstraZeneca as well, those vaccines were developed with huge money from the state, right? So I think that's some of the irony now when those manufacturers say that loosening the patents would be, a disincentive going forward. They were almost 100% publicly funded, and the mRNA platform that they use was also decades of public research that went into it. And I have a figure here that BioNTech, which is here a company from your country here in Germany, received 445 million euros in public funding. And with that, the Pfizer vaccine smashed the records for annual sales and became the first pharmaceutical company with annual revenues of 100 billion. And Moderna has raked in, huge profit margins. So that's one response in terms of the public funding. The other thing that I would say, the irony of these companies now refusing to share the patent, but also refusing to share knowledge about their vaccines. So some of you might have heard of the hub, the mRNA hub that's being developed in South Africa with support of the WHO, with groups around the world that are developing the technology and learning how to make these vaccines. Moderna has completely refused to share any of its knowledge with them, and the work of this hub has been delayed by over a year for that period, over a year for that reason. So just to say, and the problem with delaying is that this work is not only for COVID. I mean, if there is ever an HIV vaccine, it will probably be on an mRNA platform. There are cancer drugs that could also be developed. So now these companies that are working in collaboration with this hub are working on COVID, but also looking towards the future, whereas the companies are more thinking of how much money they could make on an HIV vaccine or how much they could make on a cancer drug going forward. So I don't know if that answers your question, or if I'm more just agreeing with you that yes, many of these products were developed with public funds. In fact, the BioNTech vaccine is your vaccine. If you're German, it's your vaccine. It was developed with public funds, and now the irony of that is that they're saying that it's going to stifle innovation for the future and are refusing to share knowledge, and actually have made some very problematic statements about how their products could not possibly be made in the global south. How could a company in a tropical country make this product, as if you have to be sitting, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or in Oxford to be able to make these vaccines, whereas we know that products have been made. I mean, India is basically the pharmacy of the world, making 60% of all the medication that we use. So that's also a battle that we have to fight on that front as well, and a lot is being done around sharing technology and making sure that the capacity is there. Thank you.
Merci. Une autre question.
Bonjour à toutes. Eric Nemes de Attaque Liège, Attaque Belgique. La question c'est que pouvons-nous faire vu qu'on a un outil dans les multinationales comme Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Bayer, etc. Nous avons des comités d'entreprise et au niveau européen, on a des comités d'entreprise européens. Le projet de ces comités d'entreprise, c'était après la guerre que le capital avait le même pouvoir que le travail. Les représentants des travailleurs dans ces entreprises reçoivent l'information du prix des vaccins, etc. Donc, nous avons le pouvoir d'arrêter, si on veut utiliser les droits donnés aux travailleurs de manière correcte, de donner l'information et puis de réorienter autrement la distribution des vaccins. On peut bloquer dans un comité d'entreprise européen les décisions. Le problème, c'est que l'Europe donne la priorité au lobby et au capital et au privé. Et une des choses qu'il faudrait faire, c'est que dans tous les hôpitaux, dans toutes les entreprises de recherche, dans toutes les entreprises de santé, on décide qu'il n'y a plus qu'un seul syndicat qui représente tous les travailleurs. Pourquoi dans le même hôpital, l'infirmière, le docteur, la kinésithérapeute, ceux qui nettoient, doivent appartenir à des syndicats différents? C'est parce qu'on accepte de se diviser. Changeons ça dans nos syndicats et on pourra changer le rapport de force.
Merci. Nous pouvons prendre à nouveau une autre question, si vous le souhaitez. Oui.
Ich bin Margarete. Die Frage ist vielleicht naiv. Ich verstehe nicht, warum der Staat nicht selber die Medikamente herstellen kann. Der Staat finanziert die Forschung. Wieso geht es nicht, dass wir das selber produzieren?
Oui, Ricardo.
Oui, la réponse, c'est que l'État et nous, les citoyens, nous avons accepté que ce soit seulement les sujets privés porteurs d'intérêt qui doivent s'occuper de tout. Ils doivent s'occuper de la vie, doivent s'occuper des fleuves, doivent s'occuper de l'éducation, doivent s'occuper de la maternité, doivent s'occuper de la science. Nous sommes dans une société qui désormais, structurellement, nous avons intériorisé le paradigme que le public, l'État, etc., doivent agir le moins possible. Et que seulement les sujets qui sont légitimement, surtout sur le plan économique et financier, capables d'organiser l'utilisation des ressources matérielles et immatérielles disponibles, ont le pouvoir de décision en matière d'allocation des ressources. Autrement dit, et aussi c'est la même question, notre ami Eric des syndicats, les syndicats ne sont pas unis parce que les syndicats eux-mêmes ont accepté l'idée du management, l'idée que seulement les porteurs d'intérêt, seulement les entreprises privées sont capables de mettre ensemble tous les facteurs de production, à commencer par la connaissance. Un point fondamental, on reviendra peut-être à la partie finale, pour ce qui me concerne, en tant que la priorité des actions, c'est aujourd'hui travailler sur la connaissance. C'est décommodifier la connaissance. C'est libérer l'humanité des brevets. Nous devons lutter non pas pour la suspension temporaire des brevets sur les vaccins ou sur les médicaments. Nous devons lutter nous devons lutter pour l'abolition sic et simplicitaire des brevets. Une société ne peut pas être capable de répondre aux droits de tout le monde s'il accepte le principe qu'on peut breveter des connaissances sur le vivant. Tant que les syndicats eux-mêmes et tant que nous, les citoyens, on accepte l'idée qu'il est brevetable la connaissance sur le vivant, sur les molécules, sur les cellules, sur les organismes vivants, eh bien, on n'avancera pas. Au contraire, on continuera à aller vers la marchandisation de la vie Et donc, nous devenons un ensemble nous devenons une minière d'éléments naturels susceptibles d'augmenter la capacité de productivité du capital investi. Nous sommes une minière. Mon corps est une mine terrible en termes de microbes, de cellules, de molécules extraordinaires. Nous sommes une mine et nous sommes bons si nous sommes une bonne mine. Et si nous avons un corps malade qui n'est pas bon, on ne vaut rien. Donc, c'est la connaissance. Et c'est pour cela que c'est extraordinaire. Maza en parlait tout à l'heure. Quand en mars de l'an 2000, dans la première phase de la réponse au coronavirus, etc., l'Organisation mondiale de la santé proposa sans spooling, c'est-à-dire que toutes les entreprises partagent au niveau de la connaissance pré-compétitive, pas au niveau de la connaissance compétitive, c'est-à-dire celle qui est déjà dans la phase de production de produits, etc., mais dans la recherche pré-compétitive. Nous, en Europe, on l'a appelée pré-compétitive. Eh bien, pas une entreprise, pas une, a répondu oui. Pas une. Il faut les dénoncer. Ils sont des criminels. Pas une entreprise. Et pourquoi nous continuons à donner confiance à Bayer, à donner confiance à Monsanto, donner confiance à Sanofi, donner confiance à ces entreprises? Pas une de ces entreprises a dit oui, il faut partager la connaissance au stade même de la recherche fondamentale. Jamais. Alors, pour répondre à la mobilisation, et j'ai terminé, mais pourquoi acceptons-nous que l'État finance la recherche? Pourquoi l'État doit financer les privés pour faire la connaissance? Et puis l'État doit payer pour acheter les vaccins qui ont été financés, la production, par l'État. Et puis l'État s'engage, même avec l'Advance Payment System, de dire « je m'engage à t'acheter des milliards de doses. Et même si tu ne les vendras pas, on n'aura pas besoin, ben nous te payons. » C'est scandale. Un scandale, on s'arrête.
Voilà, c'est ça. On s'arrête sur le scandale. Je pense que cette première partie a bien mis en évidence la mainmise de quelques-uns, de quelques-unes sur un système global que nous dénonçons ici et que nous manquons de moyens pour le changer. Et dans la deuxième partie, on va pouvoir justement parler des luttes et des moyens à mettre en œuvre pour essayer de changer ce système. Merci. 2 minutes de pause, 2-3 minutes, et on reprend après.
weitermachen. Der zweite Part wird mehr darum gehen, welche Kämpfe und Kampagnen es gibt. Welche Kampagnen gibt es gegen die Privatisierung der Patente? Also wir fordern bei ATTAC schon lange die Freigabe aller Patente. Und wir haben hier auch gemeinsam mit Medico International Kampagnen durchgeführt, an denen die erste Sprecherin unseres Parts zum Gesundheitswesen, also zum Streik in den Krankenhäusern, auch trotz ihrer vielen Arbeit auch noch in Berlin teilgenommen hat. Und wir fangen jetzt mal mit Silvia Habekus an, die wird über den Streik in Berlin berichten. Und ich weiß, dass hier ganz viele auch aus Nordrhein-Westfalen sind, in denen in Nordrhein-Westfalen hatten die Pflegekräfte ebenfalls an den Unikliniken erfolgreich gestreikt. Silvia, dann beginn bitte. Silvia wird in Englisch sprechen.
Ja, okay. Ist es schon an? Hört ihr mich? Wir versuchen hier gerade noch mal eine schöne Präsentation zu öffnen, aber ich fange jetzt trotzdem schon mal. I was going to speak in English, I said. Okay. So we were going to open my presentation here, and it should work soon, I think. Yes, I'm also very happy to be here, and I always, when I hear colleagues from other parts of this world speaking, I always think our problems here are so minor, but we are all in the same system, and we also here, even here in Germany, especially in Germany, when you look at the health sector, it's geared towards profit, and what Ricardo also said, geared toward the market. And I'm someone really still working as a nurse in hospital, so it's not, I'm doing all this union work in my free time, and know what's actually going on in the hospitals. And the big problem during the pandemic, before the pandemic, in German hospitals, and especially for the nurses, but also for all hospital staff there, is that we were, before the pandemic, understaffed and overworked, and especially during the pandemic, that did not change. So when you look at the comparison like this, when you look at the hospitals, there's one nurse per 13 patients in Germany, and compared to Scandinavian countries, it's 1 to 4 patients. So as you can imagine, that doesn't really help when you then treat COVID patients, when you have that understaffed place. And it's also true for care workers in other areas, also in old people's home and the care at homes and so on. But I don't want to, but we are also kind of tired of always complaining about the bad situation. And what we did, and we is the hospital staff, except for the doctors in 2 big hospital systems in Berlin. So here you see the Berlin hospital strike. There were 15,000 hospital workers involved. We had 1 month of strike, and what we did reach was 3 different collective agreements for staff ratios and also raises. I'm not going to go into all the details, but I'll give you an overview of how we did that, how we organized our fight, and how we actually won. And you saw the, no, you didn't see it. It's organizing for power. That's what we did. It was clear that we would not be able to gain anything when we were doing the kind of struggle the unions used to do. And I'm talking about the civil service union in Germany here, it's Verdi. And I'm a union activist in there, and what we did change is that, usually you would only have a few activists going through the hospital and trying to agitate. And that's a weak structure. What we did now, we identified colleagues in each team, and they would organize their own team. So that way we could organize majorities in our hospitals. And this was a systematic building of power. Here you can see different teams where they had this team chart where you could see how the progress, how it was working in their team, how many got union members, how many were willing to strike, how many were discuss what their demands are. And then you had team meetings where you would come together and say, this is our demand, this is how we want to continue. And what the first thing we did was, it's called a structure test. We had, in last year, we had elections in Berlin, but also in Germany for the parliament. And we chose May 12th, that's a day for nursing, or International Nurses Day. We chose it to have a 100 days ultimatum for the government and for our hospital management to say, if you don't change anything within these 100 days, we are going to go on strike to have collective agreements. But we had collected 8,397 signatures. That's the majority of our co-workers. They said, they pledged, yes, we are willing to fight for this agreement when they don't do anything. So that's when we set our ultimatum. That was our first so-called structure test. And the second really great event, and also called structure test, was in July, where we actually were in the soccer stadium of one of the Berlin teams. And there we collectively said, these are the major demands for our struggle. So the demand was a nurse or personnel to patient ratio, and then a consequence when the ratio is not met. So we had the majority of teams with us to fight for those demands. And then, of course, you probably can imagine they did not agree for negotiations for a collective agreement. So we did go on strike, first 3 days warning strike, and then we started the strike September 7th, I think. So here you can see the strike committees in front of different hospitals. There were 11 hospitals involved in Berlin, close to half of the hospital beds in Berlin. And then we also went on the street quite a bit, as you can see here. And then after a week of the strike, we started negotiations, but we did not start negotiations in the normal union way, where a few union reps go behind closed doors. We decided that we would have the whole union delegations of union members out of the hospitals. There were 25 for the Charité, 25 for Vivantes, where I work. We were all the negotiation team. So the management was actually confronted with 25 of their workers, which really make a big difference. And then at the same time, we had the team delegates, which represent their teams next door, so that we could communicate with them, like, you know, when we had new things to discuss, when we needed information, we could go next door and they would also participate in the negotiations. And this is all while the strike was going on. And this system actually worked with the strike. And so we got 3 collective agreements. Here you can see the 3 happy negotiation teams after we got our agreements. We got 2,288 new members. We basically doubled the union membership in the hospitals. What I didn't go into is that we also we have outsourced workers at Vivantes, the city hospitals in Berlin, and they were outsourced to save money so that they could make more profit. And they also got an agreement, not as high as they wanted, but they definitely got a raise. So we had this joint struggle in the hospital. So we always, it's clear hospital work is teamwork, and you can't have, nurses on one side and cleaners on the others. We are all in one team. What we need now is to get the doctors on board, but that's always a little difficult. So this is, I just wanted to show you that there is a struggle going on, and that we are not longer willing to work under those conditions. And Charité and Vivantes, those 2 hospital systems, are public hospitals, city-owned or state-owned hospitals, but they are under the same pressure for making with this financing system, which is not geared towards the patients, but which is geared towards the money. So, and this was not the first struggle, or it was the first fight where we really had this massive, with so many workers and with all the majorities. But this year, the 6 university hospitals in North Rhine-Westphalia, they had 77 days of strike and got an agreement here in North Rhine-Westphalia, and they used the same system which we did. So they also got majorities, they got really huge negotiations teams, and they needed a little longer because, but they did reach the agreement in the end. So the fight goes on, and I hope we will also with that change the whole system, because health is a fundamental right and is not there for profit.
Vielen Dank, Silvia. Bevor ich überleite zu Masa und Dian, möchte ich noch kurz bemerken, dass Silvia und ich schon viele Jahre im Bündnis Krankenhaus statt Fabrik, wo wir uns gegen die Abschaffung der DRGs, also der Fallpauschalen, also des Preissystems in den Krankenhäusern einsetzen und fordern, dass die Krankenhäuser wieder rekommunalisiert werden in Deutschland. Dazu gibt es aber auch zahlreiche Initiativen in NRW und auch in anderen Bundesländern, die sich dafür stark machen. Also es gibt immer mehr Proteste und Menschen, die sich dagegen einsetzen. Als wir im Jahre 2002 die Gesundheitskampagne Gesundheit ist keine Ware gestartet haben, da hat uns das, was wir prophezeit haben, was die DRGs auslösen werden, nämlich eine starke Privatisierung der Kliniken in Deutschland, hat uns damals niemand abnehmen wollen. Die Kampagne verlief irgendwann. Wir sind aber am Thema dran geblieben und haben dann vor einigen Jahren das Bündnis Krankenhaus statt Fabrik mit vielen Organisationen, auch da sind auch Ärztinnen und Ärzte dabei, und zwar sehr aktive, der VDEE. Und ich möchte jetzt schon etwas ankündigen, weil es auch um den Bereich geht. Morgen wird um 16:30 Uhr die Nadja Rakowitz vom VDE, Verein der demokratischen Ärzte und Ärztinnen, und Thomas Zimli vom NRW-Streik und NRW-Verdi, die werden morgen um 16:30 Uhr einen Workshop haben, wo es darum geht, der Kampf ums Gesundheitswesen. Und Thomas wird da auch nochmal explizit über den Streik in Nordrhein-Westfalen berichten. Jetzt kommen wir aber auch zu dem, wir haben ja so viele Themen im Bereich Gesundheit, könnten wir ja Seminare füllen. Aber ich wollte dich, Masa, noch mal fragen, du hattest ja vorhin sehr schön dargestellt, um was es geht bei den Impfstoffen, und ich glaube, du weißt auch, dass ATTAC sich immer schon für die Freisetzung aller Patente, also für die Abschaffung von Patenten stark gemacht hat. Wir haben auch hier in Deutschland Kampagnen gemacht, damit die Impfstoffe wenigstens freigegeben werden. Wir haben vor BioNTech protestiert und auch in Berlin, da war auch Silvia dabei. Also hier sind auch Menschen, die interessiert sind daran, dass Wissen und Impfstoffe oder auch Medikamente geteilt werden. Also ich habe einen guten Freund in Sambia, der sitzt da in der neuen Regierung, und der hat bei einer Videokonferenz zu uns gesagt, sie hätten keine Masken, sie hätten keine Tests, und an Impfstoffe ist schon gar nicht zu glauben. Ja? Und dann wurden mal Impfstoffe abgegeben, da war das Verlaufsdatum lange überschritten. Also das ist ja dann eine weitere Klatsche. Da sieht man mal, dass der Kolonialismus und Rassismus hier bei uns noch lange nicht überwunden sind. Ich wollte dich mal bitten, ob du uns auch Beispiele von einigen Ländern vielleicht berichten kannst, wo man auch Verbesserungen sieht oder wo Menschen gekämpft haben, dass es verbessert wird. Wir wollen ja nicht nur das Desaster, das da ist, darstellen, sondern auch zeigen, es gibt immer und überall Menschen, die sich dagegen wehren. Vielleicht fällt dir dazu noch etwas ein, was du von deiner Arbeit weißt?
Thank you for that. So, you know, there is a wide variety even within the African continent. You know, there are some countries, especially the smaller countries where people speak the same language. You know, all of that helps in terms of community education and of planning. So Rwanda, for example, is quite high in terms of its vaccine rollout. Mauritius, Seychelles, you know, small countries. Morocco is a country that planned early on during that period when, as Ricardo mentioned, none of the manufacturers would join the technology access pool. Morocco went ahead and went directly to suppliers to purchase vaccines. Before the vaccines were even ready, they kind of planned in advance. So there are some countries that have been doing much better than others. And of course, as we talk about, you know, the struggles across the continent and across the world, some of the countries that I have listed as being quite low in terms of vaccinations are countries where other difficult things are going on, you know, whether it's natural disasters or conflict. So we have to keep in mind that many of those countries are dealing with several issues at the same time. You know, there are also countries that have other diseases that they're trying to address on a regular basis, whether you're talking about tuberculosis or malaria. So there's that added issue of COVID coming on top of many issues that countries are dealing with. One thing I wanted to add, you know, as Sylvia was saying that she wanted to at least give some good news of things that are going well, because some of what we had talked about in the earlier session was a little bit, you know, can be a little bit bleak and depressing. I just wanted to reassure you that across the People's Vaccine Alliance and with other activists around the world, we are constantly picking opportunities where campaigns can take place. And as you said, we've collaborated with activists in Europe, around the world. So there are days that are coming up. So for example, October 2nd is the anniversary of the TRIPS waiver application. So the date when South Africa and India put in the application 2 years ago for the TRIPS waiver. I'm hoping that there will be quite a bit of action around that period, because here we are now, it's going to be the 3rd anniversary. They really dragged their feet on the TRIPS waiver at the World Trade Organization and finally gave something that was not really all that helpful. You know, there's some flexibility for vaccines, but very little for treatment and diagnostics. The European Union has been one of the biggest blockers against this waiving of intellectual property rules. And even when it comes to testing and treatment, they're still saying that even in December, they don't think that they will waive intellectual property rules in December, which is what they had agreed on initially for testing and treatment. So I would encourage those of you who are motivated to join any campaigns at around that time to really push your governments here in the European Union that has really stood behind the pharmaceutical companies and supported them in their desire to, you know, to hang on to their patents. I wanted to just talk a little bit about, you know, the question that Dagmar, you know, had asked us when we communicated earlier, you know, are the struggles leading to improvements or progress? I know that the People's Health Movement also has a lot of work that they're doing, but I wanted to say that something that I see as progress is that we have made undeniable the link between trade and health. You know, for a lot, you know, for many people who were not involved in the HIV movement, those are two things that seem quite separate from each other. And I think that with all the action that we've done over the last 2 years, that's something that I think we can see as a positive. I think it's also become so clear that our public health system is racialized and discriminatory. You know, that's something that just a few years ago people would hesitate to say. Now I think people are being more open about that. And Dagmar, you know, you mentioned this issue of, you know, the vaccines arriving right before they expire or after they've expired. I mean, this is just a continuation of the kind of affront of the system. Just today, you know, I heard on BBC, as I was getting ready to come here, this notion that Africans are hesitant around vaccines. That's something that the CEOs of Pfizer and Moderna have been very, very happy to push. You know, it's not that we have slowed down the distribution of vaccines. It's not that we've blocked the TRIPS waiver. It's that Africans, you know, they just don't like science. They don't want vaccinations. There's no evidence whatsoever that people in Africa are any more hesitant to vaccines than people in the United States or, you know, in Austria or in Germany. But what has happened is as people have waited and tried to get their vaccines, waited in line, I don't know if you would call that hesitancy, but if I had to travel, you know, for 20 kilometers on foot and waited 4 hours and didn't get my vaccine, I probably would not be very excited to go back the next time. So in terms of implementation, there's some work that needs to be done. But when the vaccines finally do arrive and the countries have mobilized people to go, and then the vaccines are expiring in 2 weeks, that also creates more implementation issues. I think even in Munich, it would be very difficult to roll out vaccines to millions of people if you just had 2 weeks available. So you can imagine what that means for places where people have to plan longer in advance. So I think, understanding that the system is broken and that it is being conducted in this colonial, racist way is something that we've also raised awareness around. And just the public outrage, millions of people, I think since the HIV, that part of the HIV pandemic when people did not have access to treatment and others did, this is, I think, the first time that we've seen people really come out active and show their rage about the way the system is being run. And even though that can be quite hard and exhausting, I think that's also another positive thing that we sort of have to look at and take advantage of as we go forward. Unfortunately, we're seeing that it's very difficult to shame the shameless, and I think we have to strategize as activists about how to do that. Just the fact that the same exact thing we saw with the first generation vaccines, we're now seeing with treatment. They are just doing exactly the same thing. They have no shame whatsoever, and the same thing with the new vaccine. So that's something that I would like to, strategize a little bit with all of us together. How can we really shame these people? Or is there another way, Ricardo, that we can, pressure them as we think about our governments in the global south? They are being pressured by the pharmaceutical companies. They are being pressured by the governments from the north. I was just saying to colleagues that we hear stories sometimes of, straight up bribery, but even if it's not bribery, pharmaceutical company lobbyists, there are so many of them, especially in Latin America at the moment, as the Latin American countries try and push through compulsory licensing of treatments. Pfizer is sending armies of lobbyists to go and pressure people. And a colleague in Latin America was telling me that when in Colombia they were trying to pass compulsory licensing for a cancer drug a few years ago, the US Embassy threatened to pull support for the peace process in Colombia if the government of Colombia, pushed through compulsory licensing for a cancer drug that was being made by a US company. So the pharmaceutical companies and the governments are working together, and I think we really need your support as activists in Europe. The European Union, as I say, has been the biggest blocker of waiving IP rights on these vaccines and is now threatening to do the same thing for tests and treatments. So I just want to keep that in mind as we think the next couple of days of our activism. But just to say that there have been some positive steps as well. So let's keep that in mind. As Sylvia says, let's not, we don't want to depress people too much with the bad news and have some positive as well. Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank, Masa. Ich hoffe, dass dein Appell an uns alle auch wirklich wirkt. Und ich denke, wir sollten wirklich auch versuchen, so wie ihr eine Systematik in eurem Streik gesucht und gefunden habt, der ja auch funktionierte, sollten wir uns alle auch noch mal Gedanken machen, wie wir unsere Kampagnen und Proteste noch besser miteinander vernetzen können. Also es ist einmal hier, wir haben hier versucht, mit der Europäischen Sommeruniversität einen Raum zu schaffen des Austausches, der Verabredungen. Und wir müssen halt sehen, dass wir das global auch besser hinkriegen, auch systematischer und nicht nur immer bei der HIV-Entwicklung, da war ich zufällig im südlichen Afrika, habe dort gelebt und gearbeitet und habe das alles mitbekommen und habe auch gesehen, wie praktisch in Sambia die mittlere Generation, die sind gestorben. Übrig blieben die kleinen Kinder und die Großeltern und keinerlei Versorgung. Also das war schon hart und das wollen wir nicht mehr. So, jetzt kommen wir zu dir. People's Health Movement ist ja auch weltweit, global gesehen unterwegs. ATTAC und vor allen Dingen Medico International sind ja auch Mitorganisatoren. Und mich würde mal interessieren, ob du auch berichten kannst aus einzelnen Ländern, wo auch vom Public Health Movement Kämpfe oder Kampagnen gestartet worden sind, die auch einen gewissen Erfolg oder Fortschritt hatten. Bist du da informiert über deine Forschung oder bist du da involviert? Könntest du uns über deine aktuelle Arbeit noch ein bisschen mehr erzählen?
So specifically, in terms of, sorry, interpreter, I'll be speaking in English. I'm sorry I didn't let you know before. I'm letting you know now. For real progress, I mean, in terms of vaccines, Masa already told you, privatization, profiteering, they're still going on. I'm sorry, I don't think there is any good news regarding that. But echoing what Masa also said, I mean, this pandemic has made it very clear the link between trade and health, and where people didn't see it before, that they were being oppressed, they had healthcare denied from them and their rights, now are starting to see it. And people who previously were afraid to speak and complain about this are starting to wake up. It may not mean much for liberal Europe, but from where I come from, where ideas, thoughts, speech are often repressed, this is something big, I think, the progress. But, and we are gaining in numbers around the world, in Latin America, in Asia, South Asia too, and Africa. And we are consolidating. And what we hope is that Europeans are also starting to help us and realize it is a global struggle against this capitalism. We are not alone, and so far the struggles have been quite separated. They're happening in silos, in separate topics and struggles, not really converging. And I think it's moving towards that. And I previously talked about colonialism, and one of the simple narratives that is liked to be pushed in my country, and I'm sure in the other developing countries also, was that we gained our independence from the Europeans. We fought against the Europeans. It's as if we fought alone. But that is not true. The liberalism and socialism in Europe that was in the late 1900s and early 20th century, these ideas and spirits, they had a ripple effect to the developing countries, the colonial countries. And it gave us the strength and gained momentum in our fight. So it's not just World War II that gave us independence. It was a struggle, decades in the making, with the help also from European intellectuals and activists and movements. And I hope also, echoing Masa, that Europe wakes up to this global struggle and realize that we are in this together. We are not separate. It's a global system of oppression. Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank, Dian. Wir machen noch ein kurzes Schlusswort, oder nicht Schlusswort, weil wir haben ja noch Diskussion, aber so, dass du noch mal guckst, du hast dir jetzt die Beiträge angehört, wie du das jetzt noch mal einschätzt, ganz kurz, und dann geben wir die Diskussion ans Publikum.
Yes, I have the impression that we must go to the beginning. And the beginning is the fact that knowledge has been captured by economic perspective, and to give a proof of it, I was among the strategic group of my universities in the beginning of the 90s. And we had a great problem, certainly, because the University Hospital of Louvain, La Neuve, claimed independence from the university. and claiming the independence of the university was because the hospital was producing drugs, medicines, tools, which were very, very profitable. And the new wave of new medicine, new treatments, etc., based on the new biotechnologies, pushed academics, scientists, researchers, to be open to the immense opportunity, market opportunities that the new biotechnology wave has created. And they were considering the faculty of medicine in Louvain, they were considered that belonging to the university as a whole was an obstacle for even the national economy in Belgium to take opportunities from this new scientific development. And as a matter of fact, Faculty of Medicine is a university, and Louvain Hospital, the University Hospital, is a business corporation. And the more the University Hospital of Louvain produced patents, the more they got money, the more they got financial resources to expand their laboratories, to expand their activities, to create new institutes of world capacity, particularly in the field of biotechnology. And this has disrupted the function of university. And when the very law at the global level became first patent, then published, this principle destroyed the autonomy of knowledge. And this principle led to the commodification of knowledge and therefore to the marketization of universities and academic research. And gradually, politicians accepted that this was very, very important because the competitivity of the Belgian economy, European economy, etc., they loved very much all these new biotechnology-based companies. The public powers have been complices of this. So my first proposal is that this forum make a suggestion that really, as you have also said, that the abolition of the concept of patentability in any field of life, not only medicine, and in any field, we must insist is all area of knowledge cannot be patented. And we must, secondly, and I go short now, secondly, we must fight for saying that life-dependent technology, tools, medicine must be public production, must be produced by public research and production companies. And finally, there is no possibility for speculative finances. Why should we accept that derivative markets inspire investment on medical research? Why? Why should we trust the most speculative type of finance? This is the derivative products of finance. Why should we accept it? And I think that trade unions also must fight against. And finally, I guess that we must also be more stronger in fighting against the causes of illnesses, of diseases. We must fight against the reasons of diseases, not only against the production of patents by which are permitted to fight. So, against privatization of knowledge, long life to knowledge people.
Vielen Dank, Ricardo. Ich habe immer wieder etwas auf die Uhr geguckt, nicht weil ich nicht spannend finde, was Ricardo sagt, sondern ich könnte ihm noch lange zuhören, aber ihr sollt ja auch noch mal zu Worte kommen. Deshalb würde ich vorschlagen, dass heute das Publikum die letzten Worte sagt. Und ich bitte euch, an die Mikros zu kommen und eure Fragen zu stellen und bitte vorher für die Simultanübersetzerin angeben, in welcher Sprache. Da fällt Ihnen die Arbeit leichter. Darum hatten Sie mich gebeten.
Ja, danke schön für dieses spannende Panel. Ich spreche auf Deutsch. Okay, genau. Ja, ich wurde schon so ein bisschen unruhig, als es die Dynamik kam mit, wir wollen mit Positivem enden, und da bin ich auch ganz bei euch, und ich finde es auch großartig, dass die Bilder da noch hängen, und zugleich treibt mich noch so ein Eindruck um. Also ich komme aus NRW, wir haben ja, oder die Kolleginnen und Kollegen an diesen Unikliniken haben 12 Wochen gestreikt, die Erfahrung gemacht von unglaublicher Energie, das war großartig, da war Kraft dahinter, es gab auch nicht in den Medien, aber durchaus in der Gesellschaft eine Unterstützung dafür, aber auch die Erfahrung, die Gegenseite ist unglaublich stark. Sie ist unglaublich arrogant und unglaublich zynisch. Also nach 12 Wochen Streik eine ganzseitige Zeitungsanzeige zu schalten, wir präsentieren stolz die besten Arbeitsbedingungen, die es an einer Klinik je gab, das muss man sich leisten können, auch finanziell übrigens. Und was mich daher so umtreibt, ist, ich glaube, wir müssen uns darauf einstellen oder als Herausforderung nehmen für die Zukunft. Und darum finde ich das wunderbar, dass Silvia gesagt hat, das war nicht unser letzter Streik, ganz bestimmt nicht, oder Aktion oder Kampf. Also die eine Geschichte ist, dieses Teile und Herrsche hat ja auch da funktioniert. Auch die Presseerklärung von Verdi nach dem Streik hat ein paar Untertöne. Also da haben auch Kolleginnen und Kollegen in Servicebereichen gestreikt, die relativ leer ausgegangen sind. Also auch da das Teile und Herrsche, wir reden nur über Pflege und eigentlich auch nur über Pflege am Bett etc. Ich glaube, da finden wir auf ganz vielen Ebenen immer zu gucken, wieder zu spalten und nur so eine kleine Gruppe zu begünstigen. Und das nicht zuzulassen, ist unglaublich schwierig. Der zweite Teil ist, die Profitorientierung ist damit ja noch lange nicht vom Tisch. Der Kalle Kunkel hat so einen schönen Beitrag dazu auch noch mal am Freitag gehabt, ne? Auch nach dem Streikfall. Pauschalen sind immer noch da. Als Patientin sage ich, das müssen wir ja weiter auf der Agenda haben. Also ich freue mich über mehr Personal im Krankenhaus, habe dafür gestritten und alles, aber ich möchte nicht, dass daraus mehr unnötige Kaiserschnitte und mehr unnötige Amputationen resultieren. Das gehört also nach wie vor zusammen. Und die Demokratiefrage. Das war ja auch ein Eindruck aus diesen Streiks zu sagen, es ging gar nicht nur darum, wer bezahlt denn die Kolleginnen und Kollegen, da gab es ja sogar Lösungen für. Wir wollen uns nicht vorschreiben lassen, wo wir Personal hinsetzen und wer darüber bestimmt und auch nicht langfristig in Verantwortung gehen. Das heißt, dieses immer zu denken, Profit, sich nicht gegen den Profit anzugehen, diese Demokratiefrage zu stellen und sich nicht spalten zu lassen, damit wir über so Teilkämpfe wie hier an der Abteilung mehr Personal noch hinauskommen. Und das ja, erinnert mich an vieles, was sie auf dem Podium auch gesagt hat, die Systemfrage stellen, das klingt so groß, aber man kann es, glaube ich, am ganz Konkreten immer wieder aufmachen. Und wer Lust hat, sich in NRW zu dem Thema zu vernetzen, sieht uns hier so hier in der ersten Reihe sitzen und kommt bitte in der Pause mal auf uns zu. Wir freuen uns total, wenn wir mehr werden.
Ich spreche auf Deutsch. Oh, meine Stimme geht mir etwas weg. Ich hoffe, man hört mich trotzdem. Mich würde ganz speziell mal interessieren, Dagmar hat das einmal kurz angegriffen, welche Visionen gibt es für die Vernetzung? Wir sehen ja ganz viele Initiativen, die für sich einzeln und dann immer wieder auch zusammenkommen. Aber ich finde, es wäre eine Strahlkraft nach draußen, wenn sich international auf einer Plattform die Initiativen vereinigen würden und das darstellen würden, um eine größere Strahlkraft zu haben. So ein bisschen ist das ja in Berlin bei dem Streik durch die Organisation passiert. Und ich würde gerne mal wissen, gibt es da konkrete Pläne, gibt es da Visionen, Illusionen vielleicht? Man kann es ja nicht wissen, da würde ich gerne vielleicht mal gucken, ob ich da eine Antwort drauf kriege.
Wer mag antworten? Masa? Dian? Du möchtest? Du hast auch noch eine Frage. Entschuldige, das habe ich jetzt nicht. Ah ja, gut. Dann wollen wir erst die Frage beantworten. Erst alle sammeln, okay. Dann bist du dran und dann du. Bitte angeben, in welcher Sprache ihr sprecht, ja?
Oui.
Ganz klein, Deutsch.
Donc, en français. Ah, ben allez-y.
En allemand. Also eine Frage habe ich an Masa. Ich habe selber 3 Jahre im Südsudan gelebt und da gab es natürlich, klar, kaum Kliniken, also so in dem Stil, wie wir das so kennen, aber es gab natürlich Gesundheitsversorgung, und zwar die traditionelle. Und ich war ungeheuer beeindruckt von dem, was ich da erlebt und gesehen habe und finde es traurig, wenn dieses Wissen untergehen sollte. Und meine Frage ist, ob nicht Wissen in Afrika zum Beispiel, was über Jahrtausende gewonnen wurde und sehr stark ist in der Wirkung, warum das jetzt bezeichnet wird, als da gibt es kein Gesundheitswesen. Ich denke, ja doch, das gibt es und ich war beeindruckt. Aber als Frage, eine andere Frage habe ich, aber da werde ich womöglich Ärger kriegen, aber ich lebe damit. Also in Kenia zum Beispiel, da ist Bill Gates rausgeflogen, weil er Impfungen gemacht hat, die gleichzeitig junge Frauen sterilisierten. Das Gleiche ist, glaube ich, auch in Indien passiert, aber in Kenia weiß ich, dass das so war. Er ist daraufhin rausgeflogen und die jetzigen ich sage da sogenannte Impfungen zu, also zu Corona, die sind ja nicht undiskutiert. Also es gibt ja durchaus die Diskussion, dass sie weder geschützt haben, also Leute haben sich ja infiziert, obwohl sie 3-fach oder sogar 4-fach geimpft waren, wie jetzt unser Gesundheitsminister. Und also sie hatten weder einen Selbstschutz, noch hatten sie einen Fremdschutz, weil man konnte auch andere infizieren trotz Impfung. Und die Impfungen haben erhebliche Nebenwirkungen zum Teil gezeigt, also bis hin zum Tod. Also von daher denke ich, die Diskussion um die Impfung, die sollte geführt werden. Und ich finde nicht alle Produkte der Pharmaindustrie prima. Ich finde es schlimm, dass Patente gemacht werden überhaupt. Und ich stimme dazu. Wissen sollte in öffentlicher Hand und sollte nicht patentiert werden. Aber an dem Punkt dieser Impfung, dieser sogenannten, da habe ich meine Zweifel, dass sie wirklich ein Segen ist. Danke.
Oui, donc en français. Hein. Donc, bon, il y a eu deux grands sujets de discussion hein, aujourd'hui. C'est effectivement la levée des brevets sur les vaccins et je rajouterai les traitements, parce que c'est aussi important de parler des traitements à venir. Juste pour dire qu'en France, effectivement, il y a plusieurs collectifs qui existent et on continue cette lutte, mais c'est très compliqué de faire... Voilà, de gagner l'opinion publique, hein, il faut, enfin en tout cas en France, hein, il faut en avoir conscience, mais on continue, on lâche pas le morceau. Et le deuxième thème de discussion, effectivement, c'est l'accès à la santé et à la santé publique. Et Diane disait tout à l'heure que l'Europe, il fallait que l'Europe se réveille. Effectivement, enfin moi je pense que l'Europe a une responsabilité particulière de par son histoire, puisque il y a beaucoup de systèmes de santé publique en Europe et il faut pas lâcher la bride parce qu'effectivement, des gouvernements sont en train de méticuleusement et subrepticement le casser pour en arriver, comme disait, je ne sais plus qui tout à l'heure, un système américain. Et là, par exemple, en France, les gouvernements successifs, depuis des années, ont arrêté, enfin, ont diminué les formations des soignants et des médecins pour casser l'hôpital public, pour fermer des hôpitaux, des maternités de proximité. Et il faut vraiment que ce combat, parallèle à la mobilisation pour la levée des vaccins et des traitements, continue. Et effectivement, l'Europe a une responsabilité particulière. Ce qu'il faut rajouter, c'est que l'Union européenne a une grosse responsabilité. C'est nos adversaires. Et il faut également se mobiliser via des réseaux internationaux, hein, comme PHM, mais comme le réseau européen contre la commercialisation et la santé. Il en existe peut-être d'autres. Mais il faut vraiment se connecter au niveau international parce que nos adversaires sont communs. Et si on reste isolé, bravo pour la lutte hein, qui a eu lieu en Allemagne, en Rhénanie, voilà. Il y a eu aussi d'autres mobilisations dans d'autres pays. Et il faut vraiment connecter ces mobilisations entre elles pour gagner tout simplement. Voilà.
Vielen Dank. Wer möchte denn, du hattest ja eigentlich in dem Sinne keine Frage gestellt, deshalb denke ich mal, dass wir diesen Appell, den wir ja hier von allen Seiten hören, uns versuchen besser zu vernetzen, dass wir das auch zumindest auf europäischer Ebene ganz gut hinkriegen müssten. Und ich könnte mir vorstellen, dass die Plattform vom People's Health Movement, die ja eine globale Plattform ist, dass man darüber noch mehr sich vernetzen könnte. Das sind Überlegungen, die wir dann gemeinsam irgendwo beginnen müssen, dass es auch was wird, dass man nicht nur heute mal drüber redet und dann gehen wieder alle auseinander. Ich wollte Masa noch mal fragen, ob du zu der Frage der Impfstoffe noch was sagen wolltest. Ja? Und dann wollte ich alle noch mal um ein einminütiges Schlusswort bitten. Aber kurz, short.
Thank you. I'll just, in response to that comment, say that, in terms of traditional health workers and traditional health expertise, that's something that I fully agree we should not lose and we should keep supporting. And in an ideal world, there are some countries where Western practitioners of Western medicine do collaborate with traditional health practitioners because those are the people who are often trusted in their own communities and who, family members will go to first when they have a health issue. So really just keeping that communication flow going. In terms of the vaccines and safety, I mean, that's something that's discussed all over the world. There have been participants in vaccine trials in Africa as well as in Europe and in the United States, and that's something that we continue to watch, but we have to be very careful about not letting those messages ruin much of the good work that has been done in terms of making sure people are protected. And some of the biggest child immunization programs in the world are in Africa, and safety is tracked regularly. So I think that's all that I can say about that. In terms of a closing statement, I would say, working in a global alliance is difficult, especially when people are in different time zones and have different access to the internet, different languages that you have to keep in mind. But, the struggle continues. We try to pick specific days that we can work around and motivate people around. We try and gather stories and experiences and priorities from around the world, especially the countries that are most affected. And we really count on you in Europe to work with us because, as I said, your governments are some of the most difficult to deal with, and we're really counting on your help with that. And finally, I would just say, one does not have to be a nurse, I think, to realize that what we're doing with this inequity is not only silly it's not only terrible on an ethical level, it's silly on a public health level because these vaccines, these viruses will keep mutating and we will keep prolonging the pandemic. We've seen the same thing now with monkeypox, which was circulating in Africa for many years and not addressed. Now, suddenly, people are paying attention to it because it has reached the global north and it's mutating here. But for many years, people were dealing with it in Africa, and our nationalist thinking led us to feel like we didn't have to worry about it because it was over there. So, we have seen this before. We will see it again. The shaming did work in the HIV pandemic. The pharmaceutical companies dropped their lawsuit against South Africa because they were shamed. And my hope is that we can find a way to shame the shameless this time around as well. Thank you.
Silvia, darf ich dich ein kurzes Schlusswort bitten?
I'll do it in English again. Thank you very much. We definitely need to shame the shameless. I actually experience it still every day in the hospital. Our struggle still continues. What Melanie said, it's we do have our contracts, but getting them to work is really hard work, and now we can't strike, so we don't have that pressure any longer. But what I also wanted to say is in terms of the unions have the potential for the resistance we need in this situation. But it's not the union, it's the union members. We need to also, get the democracy into the unions again so that they do what we as the rank and file members want them to do. So we always struggle on two fronts, one within the union and one against this system. And so we have big struggles coming up in the fall and in the winter. And I hope that we're not going to be left alone by the general public. And then, of course, we need to share the experience and globally, there is actually something going on which is really exciting. This concept of majority strikes is a global concept which is actually coming from the US. I've been in lectures on digital lectures, on Zoom, where we had participants from, I think, like 40, 50 countries all over the world learning these strategies to find majorities to fight in their workplace, in their system. So I hope this is continuing, and just look for it and spread the word and the strike.
Vielen Dank, Silvia. Dian, ein Schlusswort?
Thank you, Dagmar. I would like to close by giving some ideas for building the movement to network. The idea, an event like this is certainly a good idea. We should have more of it. I think there's another one planned for next month in Belgium, Manifiesta, which is also a big one. PHM Europe is also holding another social weekend in November, I think in Madrid, which everyone can participate in. And there will be an International People's Health Assembly held by the PHM. We don't know where it is yet, but it will be next year. We will announce it in our Twitter page and web page and also Facebook usually. So that's a good idea to network, but we also do a lot of things virtually. Every so often, webinars, trying to share the knowledge, communicating with those who are on the ground, doing the field work and protesting. PHM has a network at the global, regional, and country levels. So, and it's everyone can participate in, no matter what your background is. Not because it's health is not just for medics. We're not fighting for medical care. We're fighting for health. So that involves all multidisciplinary backgrounds, all kinds of work, whatever you want to, whatever capacity you want to offer. And also for young people, I guess there is a room to participate in the WHO Watch, where as I explained before, we intervene in the WHO Assembly and the Executive Board meetings to do a policy analysis and help advise delegates from developing countries who are usually low in capacity to deal with this lobbyists in the institutions. There is also what we call the IPHU, which is a short course training about health and all that's related to it, to understand the global system and the global struggle also. They have different themes, and many people can apply to this as well. And we also have thematic groups, research. In separate groups, we do our work, and we publish Global Health Watch, which is what we call an alternative to World Health Report. And it usually gives the honest truth of what's happening on the ground, also what the evidence academically. So I would like to close there. I'm happy to connect with you. Maybe we can talk after this. Thank you.
Also wer sich für die Mitarbeit in People's Health Movement interessiert, kann sich ja auch wieder an Diane richten und dann noch weitere Adressen bekommen. Ricardo, darf ich dich nochmal ums letzte Schlusswort bitten?
Merci beaucoup. Deux choses. Il me semble que la lutte globale à ce niveau doit être poursuivie surtout dans le domaine financier. Tant qu'on laisse que l'actuel système financier se base sur le marché boursier spéculatif, je crois que nous ne gagnerons pas beaucoup. Tant qu'on laisse le système financier tel qu'il est, malheureusement, je dois dire que tous nos enthousiasmes, tous nos utopies vont se fracasser devant cette force blindée de la finance actuelle. Donc, par exemple, il faut se battre à ce que la finance spéculative ne puisse pas traiter les transactions de type industriel, de type scientifique, de type commercial. Il faut sortir tout ce qui est de la santé, de la vie, de la protection, de droit à la vie de tous les habitants de la Terre, compris les autres êtres non humains. Et la deuxième chose, c'est que nous devons nous doter au niveau des communautés d'un système de conseil de sécurité de la santé. L'Agora des habitants de la Terre a travaillé beaucoup sur la création de conseils de sécurité de l'eau. Et les liens avec la santé sont très importants. C'est pourquoi n'avons-nous des alertes qui nous arrivent dans nos téléphones chaque jour à 7 milliards de personnes, de dire 3 milliards et 6 personnes qui n'ont pas de sécurité sociale, tu ne peux pas dormir cette nuit, tu ne peux pas manger. Pourquoi ne pas avoir ces systèmes de conseil de sécurité qui disent hey, attention, pourquoi dès que dans un pays on dit que seulement 10% ont été vaccinés, ben, il faut mettre les dirigeants qui sont responsables en prison. Non. Pourquoi n'avons pas, nous, cette alerte de la sécurité de la santé? Et donc, mais ça, au niveau local, et pas seulement au niveau mondial, ou ni au local, au niveau, à tous les niveaux, il faut avoir des conseils de sécurité citoyens de la santé qui font les alertes et de dire tu ne peux pas continuer. Syndicat allemand, vous ne pouvez pas continuer. Toi, banquier de Deutsche Bank, tu ne peux pas investir. Ainsi de suite. Je crois que c'est important. Excusez-moi. Allez, bonne fin de journée.
Ja, Ricardo auch. Vielen Dank. Ich glaube, das können wir alle mittragen. Bevor wir alle auseinandergehen, möchte ich noch die weiteren Workshops zum Thema Gesundheit kurz ankündigen. Bereits heute um 16:30 Uhr wird es genderspezifische Lehren aus der Pandemie als Hebel für soziale und feministische Transformation geben mit Muriel Gilbert. Am Freitag um 10 Uhr, also morgen um 10 Uhr, Pandemien, Patente und Gewinne. Wie geht es weiter im Kampf gegen die großen Pharmamonopole? Und da werden Tim Berli, Nick Derden und Masa wird auch dabei sein bei diesem Workshop und Sondra Dahlen. Und wir haben noch was um 16:30 Uhr am Freitag, der Kampf um das Gesundheitswesen. Da geht es um das Gesundheitswesen in Deutschland und der Kampf gegen die Kommerzialisierung und Privatisierung, Abschaffung DRGs, gegen die Schließung von wohnortnahen Krankenhäusern, für die Rekommunalisierung der Gesundheitsversorgung als öffentliche Daseinsvorsorge in Deutschland. Und das macht Nadja Rakowitz von VDEE Und dabei ist Thomas Zirmny von NRW Verdi und der wird dann auch nochmal ergänzend über die Streiks in NRW berichten. Ich möchte mich bei euch allen bedanken, dass ihr zum Teil weit hergereist seid. Ich möchte mich bei der Vorbereitungsgruppe, ja. Ich möchte mich bei allen bedanken, die mitgewirkt haben und bei euch, dass ihr über 2 Stunden so aufmerksam hier die Veranstaltung innerlich nicht nur verfolgt, sondern ich sah auch, dass ihr innerlich beteiligt seid. Dann gebe ich nochmal das Wort an Marie-Dominique.
Ja, danke Dagmar. Ich wollte nur zusätzlich darauf hinweisen, dass wir in der Vorbereitungsgruppe mit anderen also Organisatoren von diesen Workshops überlegt haben, dass wir auch diese Sommeruniversität dafür benutzen, uns tatsächlich mehr zu vernetzen. Und ich sage das hier, weil ich den Eindruck habe, dass nicht nur Interessierte dabei sind, sondern wirklich aktive Menschen in dem Bereich der Gesundheit. Wir planen morgen Mittag in der Mittagspause so ein Vernetzungstreffen zu organisieren. Das Weitere bitte guckt bei dem Infopoint, was es irgendwo geben soll, also wo und wie. Zweitens, es sind bestimmte internationale Aktionstage angekündigt worden. Für die deutschen Menschen hier weise ich auf einen Kongress im nächsten März. Aber das alles werden wir auch aufschreiben auf irgendwelche Plakate. Vielen Dank an alle und guten Appetit.